"Don't go to the meeting," whispered the cleaner to the millionaire who was preparing to leave the house. Victoria Matthews had grown accustomed to the emptiness of Horizon Tower at night. The pristine marble floors of the corporate headquarters reflected the dim emergency lights, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere across the building's 30 floors. As she pushed her cleaning trolley through the executive floor corridor, her footsteps echoed in the silence that only 3 a.m. could bring. At 42, Victoria had mastered the art of becoming invisible. She moved through the spaces of the powerful with practiced ease, dusting their awards, emptying their bins, and wiping away the fingerprints from their glass doors. The night shift suited her. Fewer people meant fewer pretenses, fewer forced smiles, and more time with her thoughts. The executive floor was her last stop for the night. She preferred ending her shift here. Something about the expansive views of London's skyline brought her a strange comfort. The city lights twinkled like stars beneath her, a reminder that life continued even in the darkest hours. As she methodically worked her way through the corridor, her mind wandered to the same place it had for the past 15 years. Sarah Matthews, her mother, had been her anchor, her confidant, her everything. The image of her mother's bright smile remained frozen in time, like a photograph that refused to fade. The official report had called it an accident, a tragic collision on a rainy night. But something about it had never sat right with Victoria, like a puzzle piece that looked correct but wouldn't quite fit. The sound of voices pulled her from her reverie. At this hour, the building should have been empty except for security and cleaning staff. Victoria's hand stilled on the handle of her mop as she noticed light spilling from beneath the slightly ajar door of the CFO's office. "The board meeting tomorrow is our chance, Eleanor," a male voice said, its tone sharp with ambition. Victoria recognized it immediately as belonging to James Harrison, the company's chief financial officer. "Everything is in place. Once we present the fabricated audit results, the board will have no choice but to remove Richard from his position." Victoria's heart began to race. Richard Palmer was the company president, known throughout Horizon Corporation for his integrity and fair leadership. She had cleaned his office countless times, noting how he always left small thank you notes for the cleaning staff, the only executive who bothered to acknowledge their existence. "Are you certain the documents will hold up to scrutiny?" The second voice belonged to Eleanor Blackwood, one of the most influential board members. "Richard isn't a fool, James. He's been in this business longer than both of us combined. Trust me, Eleanor, I've spent months preparing for this. Every transaction, every number has been carefully adjusted. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, it will be too late. Richard will be ruined, and the board will practically beg me to take his place." Victoria's hands trembled as she gripped her mop tighter. The confidence in Harrison's voice sent chills down her spine. This wasn't just corporate politics. This was a calculated takedown. "And what about the ethical implications?" Eleanor's voice carried a hint of hesitation. "We're not just talking about removing Richard. We're destroying his reputation, his legacy." Harrison's laugh was cold, devoid of empathy. "Ethics? In this world, Eleanor, you either control or get controlled. I watched my father lose everything because he played by the rules. I swore I would never let that happen to me. Richard's idealistic approach to business is outdated. He's standing in the way of progress, of profit. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." Victoria backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. Her mind raced with the weight of what she'd just heard. In all her years of invisible service, she had overheard countless conversations, office gossip, personal phone calls, business discussions. But this was different. This was a conspiracy that would destroy a good man's life. As she retreated to the safety of the cleaning supply room, Victoria's hands shook as she organized her supplies. The practical part of her mind urged her to forget what she'd heard. After all, who would believe a night cleaner over the word of a CFO? She had built a quiet life for herself, one that allowed her to pay her bills and maintain her small flat in South London. Was she willing to risk everything? But as she gathered her belongings at the end of her shift, watching the first hints of dawn color the London sky, Victoria knew she couldn't stay silent. The memory of her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Sometimes, love, doing the right thing is the hardest thing." With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone and searched for Richard Palmer's address in the company directory she had access to for emergency cleaning calls. The weight of her decision pressed heavy on her shoulders as she left the building. In a few hours, Richard Palmer's life would change forever, one way or another. And despite her years of practiced invisibility, Victoria Matthews was about to step into the light. The Georgian townhouse in Kensington stood quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Victoria's breath came out in small clouds in the chilly morning air as she gathered her courage. The brass number 23 gleamed faintly under the streetlight, confirming she had the right address. Her finger hovered over the doorbell for several seconds before she finally pressed it. The wait seemed eternal. Victoria shifted from foot to foot, questioning her sanity with each passing moment. What if he called the police? What if Harrison somehow found out she was here? The sound of approaching footsteps from inside made her heart leap into her throat. The door opened, and Richard Palmer appeared wearing a dressing gown over his pajamas. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, but his eyes were alert and questioning. Victoria had seen him countless times in the building, but never this close, never without his usual suit and commanding presence. He looked surprisingly human. "Yes?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice as he took in the sight of the nervous woman on his doorstep. "Mr. Palmer," Victoria began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Victoria Matthews. I work on the night cleaning staff at Horizon Tower." She watched recognition flicker across his face. He was probably remembering the thank you notes he left for the cleaning team. "Is something wrong at the building?" he asked, concern replacing confusion. Victoria glanced nervously at the street behind her before looking back at him. "Please, sir, don't go to the board meeting today." Palmer's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me. The CFO, Mr. Harrison, he's planning something. I overheard him talking with Ms. Blackwood in his office a few hours ago. They've prepared false documents to present to the board. They want to remove you from your position." The president's expression remained neutral, but Victoria noticed his grip tighten slightly on the doorframe. "That's quite an accusation, Ms. Matthews. Perhaps you'd better come inside." The interior of Palmer's home was warm and tastefully decorated, with dark wooden floors and cream-colored walls lined with art. He led her to a study filled with books and gestured for her to sit in a leather armchair while he took the seat behind his desk. "Now," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "please tell me exactly what you heard." Victoria recounted the conversation in detail, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As she spoke, she watched Palmer's expression grow increasingly grave. When she finished, silence filled the room. "Why did you come to warn me?" he finally asked. "Surely you realize this could put your job at risk." Victoria's thoughts turned to her mother, to the questions that had haunted her for 15 years. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, Mr. Palmer. And because you're one of the few people in that building who sees us, the cleaners, the security guards, the maintenance staff. You treat us like we matter." Palmer studied her for a long moment, then reached for his phone. "Simon?" "Yes. I know it's early. I need you at my house immediately. We have a situation." He ended the call and looked back at Victoria. "That was Simon Blackwood, my personal lawyer. Coincidentally, he's also Eleanor Blackwood's brother. Though they haven't spoken in years, he's one of the few people I trust completely." Within 20 minutes, Simon Blackwood arrived, a tall man with sharp features and alert eyes despite the early hour. He listened intently as Palmer recounted Victoria's story, occasionally making notes on his tablet. "If what Ms. Matthews heard is accurate," Simon said, "we need to move quickly but carefully. James Harrison is not a man to be underestimated. He's built a network of influence within the company over the years." "I've been suspicious of some of our recent financial reports," Palmer admitted, "but Harrison's team handles all the detailed documentation. He's created a system where everything passes through him first." Victoria cleared her throat nervously. "I could help," she offered. "I have access to the entire building at night. Nobody notices the cleaning staff. We're like ghosts." Simon and Palmer exchanged looks. "It would be dangerous," Palmer warned, "if Harrison discovers you're involved." "I've been invisible for 15 years, Victoria said, surprising herself with her determination. "Perhaps it's time to use that invisibility for something important." As the sun began to rise over London, the three unlikely allies formed a plan. Simon would begin a discreet investigation into Harrison's financial records, while Victoria would use her night shift access to search for any physical evidence that might have been overlooked. "Be careful," Palmer warned, as Victoria prepared to leave. "Harrison is ruthless when he feels threatened. We'll need to communicate carefully." He wrote down a secure email address and passed it to her. "Use this to contact us." "It's untraceable." As Victoria stepped out into the morning light, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. The weight of her mother's absence seemed lighter somehow, replaced by a new sense of mission. But as she made her way home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped onto a path that would change her life forever. Unknown to her, a dark sedan parked across from Palmer's house had captured her departure on camera. In his office at Horizon Tower, James Harrison studied the image on his phone, his expression darkening as he recognized the night cleaner leaving the president's home. That evening, Victoria returned to Horizon Tower with newfound purpose beneath her usual quiet demeanor. The familiar weight of her cleaning uniform felt different somehow, like armor rather than a disguise. She arrived early, using the extra time to memorize Simon's instructions about which documents might prove useful. The lower floors passed in a blur of practiced motions, mopping, dusting, emptying bins, but her mind stayed focused on the task ahead. The executive floor would be her real workplace tonight. As she pushed her trolley into the service lift, her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Evening, Victoria," called George, the night security guard, as she emerged on the executive floor. "Bit earlier than usual tonight?" "Just trying to get ahead," she replied with a carefully practiced smile. "Bank holiday weekend coming up. Want to make sure everything's perfect." George nodded approvingly. "Always the conscientious one, aren't you?" "Mr. Harrison's still in his office, by the way." "Been there all day. Barely stepped out." Victoria's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her composure. "Thanks for the warning. I'll start at the other end of the floor then." She began in Richard Palmer's office, noting how different it felt now that she knew him personally. The thank you notes on his desk seemed to carry more weight. As she cleaned, she carefully observed everything, looking for any signs that Harrison's people might have tampered with Palmer's files or planted false evidence. In the adjacent conference room, Victoria discovered something unusual while wiping down the sophisticated teleconferencing equipment. A small device was attached beneath the main console, barely visible unless you were at floor level. She photographed it with the secure phone Simon had provided, careful not to disturb it. Hours passed as she worked her way methodically through the floor. Harrison remained in his office, the light visible beneath his door. Victoria could hear him speaking quietly on the phone, though the words were indistinct. Finally, around midnight, his door opened. Harrison emerged, his suit still immaculate despite the late hour. He paused when he saw Victoria, and something in his gaze made her blood run cold. "Ah, the night cleaner," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Victoria, isn't it?" She nodded, keeping her eyes downcast as she had done hundreds of times before. "Yes, sir. You've been with us quite a while, haven't you?" He stepped closer, and Victoria fought the urge to step back. Reliable employees are so valuable. It would be a shame if anything were to disrupt that reliability. The threat in his words was clear, though his smile never wavered. Victoria's hands tightened on her mop handle. "I just do my job, sir." "Of course you do." Harrison straightened his tie. "Keep up the good work, Victoria, and remember, reliable employees know when to keep their eyes and ears to themselves." He strode toward the lifts, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. Victoria waited until the lift doors closed before releasing the breath she'd been holding. Her hands shook as she sent a quick message to Simon through the secure phone. "Harrison knows." The response came almost immediately. "Keep going, but be careful. More eyes watching now." Victoria continued her rounds, her senses heightened to every sound, every shadow. In the records room, she discovered that several files from 15 years ago were missing, their absence marked only by dust-free spaces on the shelves. She documented everything, knowing that even small details could be important. As she cleaned Harrison's outer office, movement in the street below caught her eye. A dark sedan was parked across from the building's entrance, its headlights off, but engine running. The same car had been outside her flat earlier that day. Around 2 a.m., Victoria entered the office of Eleanor Blackwood. Unlike Harrison's minimalist space, Eleanor's office held personal touches, family photos, art pieces, educational certificates. As Victoria carefully dusted the frames, she noticed something odd about one of the photographs. It showed a company gathering from years ago, dozens of employees posed on the building's steps. Victoria's heart nearly stopped when she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. There, standing in the back row, was her mother. With trembling fingers, Victoria photographed the image. Her mother looked younger, professional in a business suit, her smile confident. The photo's date stamp read 2009, just months before the car accident that had taken her. But what was her mother doing at Horizon Corporation? She had worked as a primary school teacher, or at least that's what Victoria had always believed. More questions flooded her mind, each one leading to darker possibilities. A noise in the corridor made her quickly resume her cleaning duties. Heavy footsteps approached, security doing their rounds. Victoria forced herself to breathe normally as the guard passed by, checking doors. When she finally finished her shift as dawn approached, Victoria felt the weight of her discoveries pressing down on her. The secure phone buzzed with a message from Simon. Meeting at safe location, 10 a.m. Sending coordinates. As Victoria left the building, she noticed the dark sedan was gone, but somehow that didn't make her feel any safer. The early morning air felt thick with tension, as if the very streets of London were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The safe location turned out to be a private room above an old bookshop in Bloomsbury, its windows overlooking the British Museum. Victoria arrived precisely at 10 a.m., her mind still racing from the previous night's discoveries. Simon and Palmer were already there, surrounded by papers and laptop screens. "You've done excellent work," Simon said, as Victoria shared everything she'd found. He studied the photo of the surveillance device with particular interest. "This confirms our suspicions about Harrison monitoring board meetings, but this," he pointed to the photograph with Victoria's mother, "this might be more significant than we realized." Palmer leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. "Sarah Matthews," he murmured, studying the image. "I remember her. She wasn't just any employee. She worked in our financial oversight division." Victoria's world tilted slightly. "That's impossible. My mother was a teacher. She never mentioned working in finance." "She was more than that," Palmer continued, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah was one of our best analysts. She had an eye for detail that made her exceptional at spotting discrepancies. She left quite suddenly, as I recall. Shortly before the accident," Victoria finished, her voice barely a whisper. Simon was already typing rapidly on his laptop. "I've been digging into Harrison's history with the company. He became CFO 15 years ago, right around the time of your mother's departure." Victoria's mind raced through 15 years of questions, of grief, of uncertainty. "The missing files I found in the records room, they were from that same period. Harrison's been methodically erasing traces of something," Simon mused, "but he couldn't erase everything. Not the physical photographs, not the digital breadcrumbs that always remain." A knock at the door made them all freeze. Simon relaxed slightly when Eleanor Blackwood entered, looking elegant but troubled. "Eleanor," Palmer greeted her cautiously. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," she admitted, taking a seat. "But I can't continue supporting Harrison's schemes, not after what I've learned." She turned to Victoria. "I saw you in the building last night. Harrison has people watching you. He's paranoid about what you might have overheard." "What made you change sides?" Simon asked his sister, their first direct conversation in years. Eleanor pulled out a USB drive. "Because I found these. Financial records from 15 years ago, hidden in an encrypted folder. Harrison thought he'd deleted them, but I've always kept backups." She paused, looking at Victoria. "They involve your mother, Miss Matthews, and they paint a very different picture of what happened 15 years ago." Victoria's hands trembled as Simon connected the drive to his laptop. The screen filled with spreadsheets, emails, and documentation that told a story of systematic fraud spanning years. But more importantly, they showed a pattern of discovery, notes and findings in Sarah Matthews's meticulous handwriting, building a case against Harrison's early financial manipulations. She was investigating him, Victoria realized, her voice thick with emotion. "All this time I thought she was just a teacher, but she was actually a whistleblower," Palmer finished, "and a very thorough one. These documents would have been devastating to Harrison's career." "They still could be." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Harrison has built his entire empire on fraud. He's been systematically looting the company for years, hiding it behind complex financial instruments and fake accounts. Your mother found out, Victoria. And I think," I think she might have paid a terrible price for that discovery. The implications hung heavy in the air. Victoria felt tears threatening, but forced them back. The accident. Was it really an accident? Simon studied more documents from the drive. According to these records, your mother accessed her private bank account the day after the accident. There were several large transfers to an offshore account. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. Unless she's alive, Palmer said quietly. Unless the accident was staged to protect you both. The room fell silent as the weight of this possibility settled over them. Victoria's world, already tilted, now seemed to spin completely off its axis. Everything she'd believed for 15 years, her mother's death, her own quiet existence, her invisibility, had been built on a foundation of secrets and lies. We need to move carefully, Simon warned. If Harrison realizes we're close to the truth, he'll do anything to stop us. Victoria, your mother might have left other clues, other evidence. We need to find them before Harrison does. Eleanor stood, straightening her suit jacket. I should get back to the office. Harrison's calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. He's accelerating his plans. Be careful, Simon told his sister. Harrison trusts you now, but if he suspects... I know how to play my part, Eleanor assured him. I've been doing it for years, perhaps too many years. As the meeting broke up, Victoria remained seated, staring at her mother's face on the computer screen. The woman she'd mourned for 15 years might be out there somewhere, alive, waiting, but finding her would mean confronting Harrison and all his power. We'll help you, Palmer promised, squeezing her shoulder gently. Whatever the truth is, you don't have to face it alone. Victoria nodded, determination replacing shock. Somewhere in London's grey morning, a dark sedan was probably following her movements. Harrison's eyes were watching, his network spreading like a web across the city. But for the first time in 15 years, Victoria felt truly awake, truly visible. Her mother had fought this battle before. Now it was her turn to finish it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Victoria's small flat as she sat surrounded by old photographs and documents. Everything she owned that might contain a clue about her mother's past lay spread across her coffee table. Simon had given her a secure laptop, encouraging her to look for patterns, anything unusual in her mother's final days. A knock at the door made her freeze. Through the peephole, she saw Mrs. Chen from next door, holding a package. This came for you earlier, the elderly woman said, handing over a plain brown envelope. The delivery man was quite insistent about getting the right flat. Victoria's heart raced as she examined the package. No return address, no markings, just her name typed in a standard font. Inside, she found a single USB drive and a note. Your mother was smarter than them. Check her old email. Password, Bluebells in Spring 1969. The handwriting was Eleanor's. With trembling fingers, Victoria plugged the drive into the secure laptop. It contained hundreds of archived emails from her mother's personal account, ones that Harrison's team had apparently missed in their digital cleansing. Most were ordinary, bills, newsletters, casual correspondence. But then she found it. A draft email, never sent, dated the day before the accident. The subject line read, "For Victoria, when it's safe. My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong, or perhaps finally right. I've discovered things at work that put us both in danger. If I disappear, know that every choice I made was to protect you. I've left breadcrumbs, careful ones. Remember the story I used to tell you about the princess who left jewels to find her way home? Look for my jewels, Victoria. Start with the blue sapphire, all my love, Mum." Victoria's mind raced. The sapphire, her mother's favorite piece of jewelry, supposedly lost in the accident. Except Victoria had it, tucked away in her bedroom drawer, found mysteriously in their mailbox a week after the funeral. The gem held no obvious secrets, but as Victoria examined it under the lamp, something caught her eye. Tiny numbers were etched into the silver setting, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. She sent the numbers to Simon through their secure channel. His response came within minutes. Coordinates: a safety deposit box in Dubai. Victoria's hands shook as she processed this information. Dubai, halfway across the world, yet the first concrete lead to her mother's whereabouts. But before she could respond, another message flashed across her screen, this one from Palmer. Harrison's making his move. Board meeting pushed up to tomorrow morning. Eleanor says he's nervous, making mistakes. We need whatever evidence you can find tonight. With renewed purpose, Victoria prepared for her shift, but as she left her flat, she noticed two men in suits watching from a parked car. They made no attempt to hide their surveillance. Harrison was sending a message, "We're watching." She took a circuitous route to Horizon Tower, using the tube station's crowds to her advantage. By the time she arrived for her night shift, the suits had lost her trail. The building hummed with unusual energy for the late hour. Cleanup crews were preparing the boardroom for tomorrow's meeting, and security seemed heightened. Victoria went about her routine, carefully maintaining her invisible status. Around midnight, she found herself in Harrison's office again. As she cleaned, she noticed something odd about his desk. A false bottom in one drawer, revealed only because he'd closed it hastily earlier that day. Inside, she found an old mobile phone. The battery was dead, but she pocketed it anyway. Something told her this wasn't just any discarded device. In Eleanor's office, a new photo had appeared on the wall, a recent one of the board members at a charity gala. But it was what Victoria saw in the background that made her gasp. There, partially visible through a window, was a woman whose features Victoria would know anywhere, her mother, alive. The photo was dated just 3 months ago. Victoria's hands trembled as she photographed the image, but before she could send it to Simon, the lights in the office suddenly went dark. Emergency lights kicked in, casting an eerie red glow across the floor. "Working late, Miss Matthews?" Harrison's voice came from the doorway behind her. Victoria turned slowly, her heart pounding. He wasn't alone. 2 security guards she didn't recognize stood with him. "I believe," Harrison said softly, "it's time we had a proper conversation about your mother." The red emergency lights cast grotesque shadows across Harrison's face as he stepped into Eleanor's office. Victoria gripped her cleaning cart handle, mind racing for escape routes. "I've always admired dedicated employees," Harrison said, his tone conversational but eyes cold. "But dedication can be dangerous when it leads to unnecessary curiosity." "I'm just doing my job, sir," Victoria replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Are you?" Harrison picked up a framed photo from Eleanor's desk, studying it. "Interesting how you've suddenly developed a keen interest in corporate photography. Tell me, did Palmer put you up to this, or was it our dear Eleanor's idea?" Before Victoria could respond, the office phone rang. Harrison glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "Excuse me a moment." He stepped into the corridor, leaving the 2 guards watching Victoria. The moment Harrison was out of earshot, one of the guards moved closer. "There's a service elevator behind the supply room," he whispered urgently. "Security cameras on that route are down for maintenance. Go now." Victoria hesitated, unsure if this was a trap. "Simon sent us," the guard added quietly. "But we can only maintain our cover for a few more minutes." Understanding dawned. Palmer and Simon had placed their own people inside Harrison's security team, but before Victoria could move, Harrison's voice echoed down the corridor, angry now. "What do you mean she's accessed the account? That's impossible. Lock it down now." Victoria seized her moment. She shoved her cleaning cart hard into the second guard, catching him off balance. The first guard, their ally, made a show of stumbling as he tried to catch her, giving her a clear path to the door. She ran. Behind her, Harrison's shouts echoed through the building. The emergency lights made navigation difficult, but Victoria knew these corridors better than anyone. 15 years of invisible work had taught her every corner, every shortcut. She reached the service elevator just as the building's main lights flickered back on. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of Harrison running towards her, rage distorting his features. The elevator descended rapidly to the basement level. Victoria's phone buzzed. A message from Simon. "Car waiting on Prescott Street. Red Mini. Get there." She burst out of the service exit into the cold London night. Rain had started to fall, making the streets shine under the lamplight. The sound of pursuing footsteps echoed from the building behind her. Victoria ran through back alleys and service passages, her heart pounding. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, her footsteps echoing off ancient brick walls. She could hear cars screeching in nearby streets, Harrison's men searching for her. Finally, she spotted the red Mini. Eleanor sat in the driver's seat, engine running. "Get in!" Eleanor called, throwing open the passenger door. Victoria dove into the car just as Harrison's security vehicle turned the corner. Eleanor accelerated smoothly, turning down a narrow side street where the larger vehicle couldn't follow. "Your mother's bank account in Dubai just activated," Eleanor explained, as she navigated through London's maze-like streets. Harrison's people were monitoring it, but they weren't expecting her to actually use it. "She's alive, Victoria, and she's ready to help us." Victoria clutched the old mobile phone she'd found in Harrison's desk. He kept this all these years. "Why?" "Insurance, probably," Eleanor replied, taking another sharp turn. "Harrison never throws away anything that might be useful leverage. We need to get that phone to Simon. It might contain proof of what really happened 15 years ago." They drove in tense silence for several minutes, Eleanor taking a complex route to shake any pursuit. Finally, they pulled into an underground car park beneath a nondescript office building in Hackney. "Palmer's private office," Eleanor explained. "One of the few places we're certain Harrison hasn't compromised." Inside, they found Palmer and Simon already waiting, surrounded by computers and documents. The early morning light was just beginning to creep through the high windows. "Harrison's called an emergency press conference for 9 a.m., Simon reported. "He's making his move early. He knows we're close to exposing him." "Then he doesn't know about this yet," Victoria said, placing the old phone on the desk. Simon's eyes lit up as he examined it. "This could be exactly what we need. Give me an hour with it." As Simon worked to revive the old device, Palmer turned to Victoria. "Harrison will be watching your flat. You'll have to stay off the grid for now." Victoria nodded, exhaustion finally catching up with her. But underneath the fatigue was a growing sense of hope. Her mother was alive, reaching out from Dubai. After 15 years of silence, the truth was finally emerging. "Get some rest," Eleanor advised, gesturing to a small side room with a sofa. "The real battle starts at 9. As Victoria lay down, her mind raced with questions. What would they find on Harrison's old phone? Why had her mother chosen now to make contact? And most importantly, what had really happened on that rainy night 15 years ago? The answers were coming. But first, they had to survive Harrison's next move. Simon's triumphant "Got it!" jolted Victoria awake. She dozed off on the office sofa, exhausted from the night's events. The morning sun now streamed through the windows, painting the room in shades of gold. The phone's encryption was complex, but it had one weakness, Simon explained as everyone gathered around his laptop. Harrison's arrogance. He used the same password pattern for everything, combinations of his father's bankruptcy dates. The screen displayed dozens of text messages and emails from 15 years ago, but it was a video file that caught everyone's attention. The timestamp showed it was recorded the day before Victoria's mother supposedly had her accident. With trembling fingers, Victoria pressed play. Her mother's face filled the screen, younger but unmistakable. She looked tired, worried, but determined. "This is my insurance," Sarah Matthews began. "I've discovered systematic fraud within Horizon Corporation, orchestrated by James Harrison. The evidence is conclusive. He's been embezzling funds through a network of shell companies, destroying anyone who gets in his way." Victoria's heart raced as her mother continued. "Harrison threatened my daughter when I confronted him, said accidents can happen to anyone. I won't risk Victoria's life, but I won't let him win either. The complete evidence is secure, split across multiple locations. Harrison will never find it all unless—" The video cut off abruptly. Simon quickly checked the phone's other contents. "There's more, but it's corrupted. Harrison must have tried to delete everything when he thought he didn't need the insurance anymore." "But why keep the phone at all?" Palmer wondered. "Because he wasn't certain he had found all my fail-safes," a new voice answered. Everyone turned. Eleanor stood by the door with her laptop open, displaying a video call. On the screen was Sarah Matthews, 15 years older, but very much alive. Victoria stumbled forward, tears blurring her vision. "Mum," Sarah's eyes glistened. "My darling girl, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through." How?" "Dubai," Sarah explained. "It was the only way to keep you safe. Harrison had people everywhere in London. I knew if he thought I was gone, he'd leave you alone. The accident was staged. Eleanor helped me disappear." Eleanor nodded solemnly. "It was early in Harrison's rise to power. I didn't know the full extent of his corruption then, but I knew enough to be horrified. Helping your mother was my first act of rebellion against him." "The evidence I gathered," Sarah continued, "it's all still here. Every fraud, every scheme, every threat. I've spent 15 years documenting Harrison's entire criminal empire from afar, but I couldn't reveal anything while he had the power to hurt you, Victoria." "And now?" Palmer asked. "Now it's time to end this. Harrison's greed has grown. The scheme he's planning against you, Richard. It's just the beginning. He wants to strip the company bare, leave thousands jobless while he escapes with billions." Simon was already typing rapidly. "The press conference starts in 30 minutes. Harrison will try to destroy Richard's reputation before we can move against him." "Not if we move first," Sarah said firmly. "Victoria, do you still have the sapphire?" "Yes, but the numbers weren't coordinates to a safety deposit box. They're an encryption key. Eleanor, show them." Eleanor quickly typed the numbers into her laptop. Suddenly, screens around the room lit up with documents, photographs, and financial records. 15 years of meticulously gathered evidence. "Harrison's entire network exposed," Sarah explained. "Every fraudulent transaction, every shell company, every bribed official. I've been updating it constantly through a secure cloud server. The final piece was on that phone. The video proving he threatened us directly." Victoria stared at the screens in awe. Her quiet, unassuming mother had built this devastating case piece by piece, year after year, all while maintaining her cover in Dubai. "We have 19 minutes until the press conference," Palmer said, checking his watch. "Harrison will have security everywhere. Then it's time for some theater of our own." Eleanor smiled grimly. "Harrison thinks he's hosting a dramatic takedown? Let's give him one he'll never forget." As they quickly formed a plan, Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from George, the night security guard. "Harrison's men are clearing the building. Something big's happening. Be careful." Sarah's voice drew Victoria's attention back to the screen. "Darling, I know you have 1,000 questions, and I promise I'll answer everyone. But right now we need to focus on stopping Harrison." Victoria squared her shoulders, 15 years of grief transforming into steely determination. "Tell me what to do." The next 15 minutes were a blur of preparation. Simon coordinated with his security contacts inside the building. Eleanor prepared the digital evidence for maximum impact. Palmer made crucial calls to board members he trusted. And Victoria? Victoria prepared to step into the spotlight. For 15 years she had been invisible. Now she would make sure everyone saw exactly who she was and what Harrison had done to her family. As they left Palmer's office, the morning sun had fully risen over London. In less than an hour, the city's financial world would be shaken to its core. Harrison thought he was about to orchestrate Richard Palmer's downfall. He had no idea he was walking into his own. The Horizon Towers press room buzzed with anticipation. Financial journalists from every major publication filled the seats, summoned by Harrison's promises of a major corporate announcement. Security guards, Harrison's people, stood at every entrance. Victoria watched from a side entrance, her heart pounding. She looked different now, dressed in one of Eleanor's elegant suits, her usual cleaner's uniform abandoned. Simon's people had gotten her inside through a service entrance, past Harrison's security net. "Ready?" Eleanor's voice came through her concealed earpiece. Victoria touched her mother's sapphire, now hanging from a chain around her neck. "Ready." From her position, she could see Harrison at the podium, radiating confident authority. Board members filed in behind him, taking their seats on the small stage. Palmer's chair remained conspicuously empty. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice smooth as silk, "thank you for coming at such short notice. Today I must share some disturbing discoveries about Horizon Corporation's leadership." That was the cue. Victoria stepped into the press room just as every screen in the room flickered to life, displaying not Harrison's prepared presentation, but Sarah Matthews's face from 15 years ago. "This is my insurance," Sarah's voice filled the room. The video they'd recovered from Harrison's phone played on every screen. Harrison froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color as he watched his younger self appear on screen, threatening Sarah Matthews in his office. "Turn that off," he commanded. But the AV technicians, replaced earlier by Simon's people, made no move to comply. Victoria walked slowly down the center aisle as the video played. Journalists turned to stare, cameras swiveling to follow her progress. Through her earpiece, she could hear Simon confirming that every major financial news website was now streaming this live. "Remember me, Mr. Harrison?" Victoria's voice rang clear through the stunned silence that followed the video. "The invisible cleaner you threatened last night, just like you threatened my mother 15 years ago." Harrison's practiced composure cracked. "Security!" But when the guards moved, it wasn't toward Victoria. Simon's people, having quietly replaced Harrison's security team throughout the morning, now moved to block the exits. "The evidence my mother gathered didn't die with her," Victoria continued, reaching the front of the room. "Because she didn't die, did she? You just made us all think she did. Made me mourn her for 15 years while she built an airtight case against you from Dubai." The screens changed again, now displaying financial records, photographs and documents, the evidence Sarah had accumulated over 15 years. "Impossible," Harrison whispered, but Victoria saw the fear in his eyes. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The boardroom doors opened. Richard Palmer entered, followed by police officers and financial crimes investigators. "The board has seen everything, James," Palmer announced. "Every fraud, every shell company, every threat. Your time's up." Harrison lunged for his phone, but Eleanor was faster. "Looking for this?" She held up his device. "You really should have destroyed that old phone instead of keeping it as insurance. Hubris always was your weakness." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed, and police moved forward. Harrison looked wildly around like a cornered animal. "You don't understand," he snarled. "I built this company. I made it what it is. Palmer would have driven it into the ground with his outdated ethics." "No, James," a familiar voice cut through the noise. Every screen now showed a live feed from Dubai. Sarah Matthews, elegant and composed, looked directly at her former tormentor. "You nearly destroyed this company. The only thing you built was a web of lies." Victoria watched as Harrison's world crumbled around him. The police moved in, reading him his rights as journalists documented every moment. But Victoria barely noticed. She was transfixed by her mother's face on the screen, seeing her alive and strong after 15 years of grief. "Victoria," Sarah said softly, tears in her eyes. "It's over, darling. We're free." Through her own tears, Victoria smiled. "Come home, Mum." The press room descended into further chaos as Harrison was led away in handcuffs, shouting threats and accusations that no one bothered to hear. Financial reporters were already broadcasting the biggest corporate scandal of the decade. Eleanor touched Victoria's arm gently. "Simon's arranging your mother's return. After the police finish questioning Harrison, there'll be no reason for her to stay away." Victoria nodded, overwhelmed by the morning's events. Around her, Palmer was already addressing the press, assuring them of Horizon Corporation's stability and commitment to transparency. The sapphire felt warm against her skin, no longer a mysterious clue, but a bridge between past and future, between loss and recovery. For 15 years she had lived in the shadows, believing herself alone. But shadows, she had learned, could hide more than grief. Sometimes they concealed hope, justice, and the unstoppable power of truth. Dawn had finally broken over London, and with it, the darkness of 15 years began to fade away. The private lounge at Heathrow Airport hummed with anticipation. Victoria sat between Eleanor and Palmer, watching flight arrivals on the digital board. After 15 years, a few more minutes shouldn't have felt so endless, yet each second stretched like an hour. "Flight EK501 from Dubai has landed," the announcement echoed through the terminal. Victoria's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt, another borrowed piece from Eleanor, who had refused to let her meet her mother in her usual clothes. The past week had been a whirlwind of police statements, press conferences, and corporate damage control. Harrison's empire had crumbled spectacularly. His network of corrupt officials and business partners was unraveling daily as Sarah's evidence made its way through law enforcement channels. The financial press had dubbed it the Invisible Cleaner Conspiracy, much to Victoria's quiet amusement. "There she is," Eleanor said softly, touching Victoria's arm. Sarah Matthews walked through the arrival gates, pulling a small carry-on bag. She looked different from her video calls, more real, more present. She stopped a few feet away, drinking in the sight of her daughter. "Victoria," she whispered. Neither could say later who moved first, but suddenly they were in each other's arms, 15 years of separation dissolving in tears and broken words of love. "I'm so sorry," Sarah kept saying, holding her daughter's face between her hands. "Every day away from you was torture. But I had to keep you safe. He would have— I know, Mum, Victoria answered, unable to stop touching her mother's arms, her face, making sure she was real. I understand now. They sat in the lounge while Palmer arranged for Sarah's luggage to be collected. Mother and daughter couldn't stop looking at each other, seeing the changes time had wrought. You look so much like your grandmother now, Sarah said, squeezing Victoria's hand. I've watched you from afar when I could. Security cameras, social media glimpses, but it's not the same as seeing you, touching you. How did you do it? Victoria asked. All those years in Dubai building the case against Harrison? Sarah's eyes grew distant. At first it was just about survival. Eleanor helped me set up a new identity, a small consulting firm. But I knew Harrison would never stop looking unless he believed I was gone for good. The accident had to be convincing. The car they found? Empty. The rain helped sell the story that I'd been swept away. Eleanor made sure the investigation concluded quickly. Sarah's voice caught. The hardest part was watching you grieve. But I knew if you believed it, everyone would believe it. Your pain made my death real to the world. Victoria remembered those dark days, the fog of loss that had enveloped her. And then you started gathering evidence. I already had enough to prove Harrison's initial frauds, but from Dubai I could track his international operations, shell companies, offshore accounts, bribes. He got careless over the years, too confident in his power. I documented everything, building redundancies, fail-safes. The sapphire was just one piece. Eleanor joined them carrying coffee. Sarah's evidence has already led to arrests in 3 countries. Harrison's entire network is exposed. But why now? Victoria asked. Why reveal everything after 15 years? Sarah's expression hardened. Because Harrison was planning something bigger. The takeover wasn't just about removing Richard. Harrison had arranged to sell off Horizon's assets to shell companies he controlled. Thousands would have lost their jobs, their pensions. I couldn't let that happen. And you trusted Eleanor all this time? Not at first, Sarah admitted. But she proved herself. She was my eyes and ears inside Horizon, helping me stay one step ahead of Harrison's searches. While maintaining my role as his trusted advisor, Eleanor added wryly. It wasn't easy, but someone had to watch him up close. Victoria absorbed this, seeing the web of protection that had surrounded her without her knowledge. And now? What happens next? Now, Palmer said, returning to their group, we rebuild. Sarah, the board would like to offer you a position as head of our new corporate oversight division. We need someone with your skills to restore trust. Sarah squeezed Victoria's hand. Only if I can work from London. I'm done being away from my daughter. Of course, Palmer smiled. And Victoria, we'd like to offer you something too, a proper position in the company if you're interested. You've more than proved your capabilities this past week. Victoria thought about it, remembering the years of invisible work, of being overlooked and underestimated. Actually, I'd like to finish my education first. I never got to pursue my dreams because you were trapped in the life I left you with, Sarah finished softly. Whatever you want to do, whatever dreams you have, I'll support you. We have time now. As they left the airport, London's afternoon sun broke through the clouds. Victoria walked between her mother and Eleanor, feeling the weight of 15 years lifting with each step. The sapphire around her neck caught the light, no longer a mystery but a symbol of resilience, of love that survived separation and secrets. Her mother was home, Harrison was facing justice, and the future stretched before them, bright with possibilities. Sometimes, Victoria realized, the greatest victories come not with fanfare and dramatic confrontations, but in quiet moments like these, walking together, whole again, ready to build something new from the ashes of the past. Autumn painted London in shades of gold and amber as Victoria walked through Russell Square, heading to her evening class at University College, London. 3 months had passed since her mother's return, each day bringing them closer, healing old wounds and building new memories. The corporate world had moved on to new scandals, though the Harrison case still made headlines as more conspirators were brought to justice. He had pleaded not guilty, maintaining his defiance even from prison. The trial would start next year and both Victoria and Sarah would testify. Victoria paused to check her reflection in a shop window. Gone was the invisible cleaner. In her place stood a confident young woman, pursuing her long-delayed dream of studying graphic design. Palmer had insisted on providing a full scholarship, calling it long overdue compensation. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Dinner tonight? Eleanor's joining us? Big news to share?" Victoria smiled, typing back her agreement. These family dinners had become a cherished routine, often lasting late into the night as they caught up on 15 years of separation. Sometimes Simon and Palmer joined them, the unlikely family that had formed through crisis and triumph. The evening found them at Sarah's new flat in Bloomsbury, cozy with warm lights and the scent of home cooking. Eleanor arrived with wine and a portfolio of documents. "The board approved it unanimously," she announced over dinner. "Horizon Corporation is establishing a whistleblower protection program. We're calling it the Matthews Initiative." Sarah reached for Victoria's hand across the table. "They want us both to help design it, to ensure that no one ever has to choose between truth and their family's safety again." Victoria thought about Harrison, about how his fear of ending up like his bankrupt father had driven him to destroy so many lives. What about the employees who lost their pensions to Harrison's schemes? "That's the other news," Eleanor smiled. "The recovered funds from Harrison's offshore accounts will be used to restore every pension with interest." Richard insisted on it. They talked late into the night, discussing plans and possibilities. Sarah had thrown herself into her new role at Horizon, working to rebuild trust and transparency. Eleanor was being considered for CEO after Palmer's upcoming retirement, a position she'd earned through years of quiet resistance against corruption. Later, as they stood on Sarah's balcony watching the city lights, Victoria felt her mother's arms wrap around her from behind, just like when she was small. "Are you happy, darling?" Sarah asked softly. "With how everything's turned out?" Victoria leaned back into her mother's embrace. "I spent 15 years thinking I'd lost you, Mum. Now I have you back, I'm studying what I love, and we're helping make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else." "Yes, I'm happy." Sarah kissed her daughter's temple. "When I left that night, I thought I was protecting you by disappearing. I never imagined you'd be the one to finally bring everything into the light." "We did it together," Victoria corrected. "You gathered the evidence, Eleanor kept watch, and You were brave enough to stop being invisible," Eleanor said from the doorway. "Speaking of which, look what I found in the old records room." She handed them a photograph, yellow with age. It showed Sarah at her desk at Horizon, a young Victoria sitting on her lap, both laughing at something off-camera. "I remember this," Sarah said softly. "It was Take Your Daughter to Work Day. You were so curious about everything, Victoria. You wanted to know how everything worked, why people did what they did." Victoria traced the happy faces in the photograph. "I never lost that curiosity. Even as a cleaner, I was always watching, learning." "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Now I want to learn everything. Design, business, law. I want to understand it all. Maybe then I can help other people find their voice, their strength." The city stretched before them, a tapestry of lights and shadows. Somewhere out there, Harrison sat in his cell, his empire of lies shattered. But here, in this moment, 3 women who had chosen truth over fear stood together, planning a future built on transparency and trust. Victoria touched the sapphire at her neck, no longer a clue to a mystery, but a reminder of resilience and love. She had lived in shadows, moved through corridors unseen, believing herself alone. But darkness, she had learned, often concealed not just secrets, but strength. Sometimes the quietest people carried the loudest truths. And sometimes the long way home was the only way to find oneself. 1 year later, Victoria stood in front of Horizon Tower, watching the morning sun glint off its glass facade. The building had changed, or perhaps she was the one who had changed. Either way, it no longer felt like the fortress of secrets it once had been. Today marked the beginning of Harrison's trial, and Victoria was due to testify. The past year had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. Her graphic design courses at UCL were going well, and she had already secured an internship with a prestigious design firm. But more importantly, she had her mother back. "Ready?" Sarah asked, appearing beside her. They had developed a habit of meeting for breakfast before heading to their respective responsibilities. Sarah to her office as head of corporate oversight, Victoria to her classes, or today to court. "It's strange," Victoria replied, studying the building. "A year ago I was pushing my cleaning cart through those doors, trying to be invisible. Now you're helping shape the company's future," Sarah finished, squeezing her daughter's hand. They made their way to the Old Bailey, where the trial would take place. The media presence was substantial. The Harrison case had become emblematic of corporate corruption and its human cost. Eleanor met them at the entrance, elegant as always in a tailored suit. "The prosecution is confident," she informed them as they navigated the courthouse corridors. Harrison's former associates have been turning on him one by one, hoping for leniency. Inside the courtroom, Victoria saw Harrison for the first time since his arrest. He looked smaller somehow, his expensive suits replaced by plain clothes, his commanding presence diminished. But when he turned to look at her, she saw that his eyes still held their cold calculation. As she took the witness stand, Victoria felt the weight of the past 15 years in every word she spoke. She described her life as a cleaner, the night she overheard Harrison's plot, and the subsequent discovery of her mother's survival. Her voice never wavered, even as she detailed the years of grief she'd endured believing her mother dead. Harrison's lawyer tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she had fabricated evidence to seek revenge. But Victoria remained calm, her responses clear and honest. When asked why she had chosen to act that night rather than remain safely invisible, her answer silenced the courtroom. "Because sometimes staying silent causes more harm than speaking up. My mother taught me that even in her absence." During a break in proceedings, Palmer joined them in a private room, his presence still commanding despite his recent retirement. "The board meeting just concluded," he announced. "They've unanimously approved the expansion of the Matthews Initiative. We're extending it industry-wide, creating a network of protection for whistleblowers across the corporate sector." Sarah smiled, pride evident in her expression. "It's becoming exactly what we hoped, a way to ensure no one has to choose between truth and safety again." Victoria watched her mother, seeing not just the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her, but also the fierce professional who had spent 15 years building an airtight case against corruption. "Will you head the expanded initiative?" she asked. "Actually," Sarah replied, "they want us both involved. Your perspective as someone who saw corporate culture from the ground up is invaluable. Plus, your design skills could help make our training materials more accessible." The trial continued through the afternoon. Victoria listened as financial experts detailed Harrison's frauds, as former associates revealed the extent of his schemes, and as Eleanor testified about her years of gathering evidence while maintaining her cover. But it was the testimony of Harrison's own son, newly discovered during the investigation, that proved most damaging. James Harrison Jr., who had been raised by his mother under a different name after she fled Harrison's controlling behavior, spoke of his father's obsession with power and wealth. "He used to say that control was everything," the young man testified, that his father's bankruptcy taught him the only way to survive was to be the one holding all the strings. But in the end, he controlled nothing, not even his own fate. As the day drew to a close, Victoria and Sarah walked along the Thames, the courthouse behind them, and the city lights beginning to twinkle ahead. "I never thought I'd see this day," Sarah admitted, watching a boat pass beneath Tower Bridge. "For 15 years I lived in fear that Harrison would discover I was alive, that he would harm you. Now he's the one facing justice." Victoria linked her arm through her mother's. "We all lived in fear of him in different ways. The cleaners, the junior staff, even some of the executives. He built his power on making people feel small, insignificant. And you shattered that power by refusing to remain invisible," Sarah said proudly. "My brave girl." They stopped at their favorite cafe ordering tea and watching the city move around them. Victoria pulled out her sketchbook. She'd developed a habit of drawing during these quiet moments with her mother, capturing the scenes of their reunited life together. "What will you draw today?" Sarah asked, watching her daughter's confident strokes. Victoria smiled, continuing to sketch. "Us, here, now. I want to remember everything about this day." Because sometimes, she had learned, the most powerful moments weren't the dramatic confrontations or public victories. Sometimes they were these quiet instances of connection, of healing, of building something new from the ashes of the past. The trial would continue, justice would take its course, but here, in this moment, Victoria Matthews was exactly where she needed to be, visible, powerful, and free. 5 years later, Victoria stood at the podium in Horizon Tower's main conference room, presenting the latest expansion of the Matthews Initiative to a group of international corporate leaders. At 33, she had found her voice, both as a successful graphic designer and as a vocal advocate for corporate transparency. The presentation screen behind her displayed the initiative's new logo, her own design, a sapphire blue key unlocking a sunburst. Simple, powerful, meaningful, just like the real sapphire that still hung around her neck, a constant reminder of the path that had led her here. The power of visibility, she concluded her presentation, lies not just in being seen but in seeing clearly. In the past 5 years, the Matthews Initiative has helped protect over 300 whistleblowers across 12 countries. Each of them chose truth over fear, transparency over shadows. From her seat in the front row, Sarah beamed with pride. Now in her early 60s, she had recently stepped down as head of corporate oversight, though she remained actively involved in the initiative that bore their name. Eleanor, now Horizon's CEO, sat beside her, the two women's friendship having deepened into an unshakable bond. After the presentation, Victoria joined them in Eleanor's office, the same office where 5 years ago she had discovered the photograph that changed everything. The view of London was the same, but the room felt different now, warmer, more open. Harrison's final appeal was rejected, Eleanor informed them, pouring tea into delicate cups. He'll serve his full 20-year sentence. Victoria nodded, feeling no joy but a sense of completion. Harrison's trial had ended in a comprehensive guilty verdict, his elaborate defense crumbling in the face of overwhelming evidence. His son had attended every day of the trial, not in support of his father, but to ensure justice was served. "How's the book coming along?" Eleanor asked Sarah, who had been documenting their story. "Final chapter," Sarah replied. "Victoria's been helping with the design elements. We want it to be more than just an exposé. It's a guide for others who might find themselves facing similar choices." Victoria smiled, remembering the long evenings spent with her mother, crafting their narrative together. The book would tell not just the story of Harrison's downfall, but of all the invisible people who had found their strength and stood up against corruption. "Oh, that reminds me," Eleanor said, opening her desk drawer. "Look what the archival team found during the digitization project." She handed them a faded envelope. Inside was a letter, dated 15 years ago, written in Harrison's hand. It was addressed to Sarah, never sent. "I know you're out there somewhere, watching, waiting. I kept your daughter where I could see her, thinking you might break cover to protect her. But you were smarter than that. You turned your love into armor instead of weakness. Perhaps that's what I never understood. That real power comes not from controlling others, but from protecting what matters most." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read. "He knew, on some level, that I was alive. But his pride wouldn't let him admit he'd failed to silence me." "Pride was always his weakness," Victoria observed. "He thought being visible meant being invulnerable. He never understood that true strength often comes from the shadows, from the quiet moments, from choosing to act not for glory, but for what's right." They spent the afternoon together, these 3 women who had rewritten the rules of power in their own ways. Sarah, who had turned exile into justice, Eleanor, who had played the long game of resistance from within, and Victoria, who had transformed invisibility into strength. Outside, London hummed with life. The cleaning staff moved through the building's corridors, no longer invisible but recognized as essential members of the corporate family. In the marketplace, Horizon's stock had not only recovered, but thrived under Eleanor's ethical leadership. The Matthews Initiative had become a global standard for corporate accountability. Victoria's phone buzzed with a message. Her design firm had won another award for their work on social justice campaigns. She shared the news with her mother and Eleanor, their celebration quiet but heartfelt. "Did you ever imagine," Sarah asked, "that night when you heard Harrison plotting, that we'd end up here?" Victoria touched her sapphire, thinking of all the paths that had led to this moment. "No," she admitted. "I just knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Everything else was courage finding its way home." As the sun set over London, casting long shadows through the office windows, Victoria looked at her reflection in the glass. She saw not the invisible cleaner she had once been, nor just the successful professional she had become, but something more complete, a woman who had learned that every voice matters, that every truth deserves to be heard, that even the quietest whisper can change the world. The sapphire caught the last rays of sunlight, sending blue reflections dancing across the walls. In its facets, Victoria saw all the stories yet to be told, all the truths yet to be spoken, all the invisible ones yet to find their light, and she was ready to help them shine.